January 17, 1946, somewhere in the fertile plains of the American Midwest. The winter sun hung low over frozen fields, casting long shadows across the snow-dusted earth. A Japanese soldier, no longer a soldier but a prisoner of war, stood at the edge of a farmhouse porch, his breath forming clouds in the frigid air. His hands, calloused from years of military service and months of captivity, now gripped the handle of a pitchfork. Behind him, the vast American landscape stretched endlessly, a sea of white interrupted only by the skeletal frames of bare trees and distant silos. He had been trained to die for the emperor. He had been prepared for torture, for humiliation, for the slow erasure of his humanity. Instead, that morning, a farmer's wife had handed him a plate of eggs, bacon, and toast, more food than he had seen in a single meal since before the war began. And at the end of the week, they told him he would be paid. This was not the America he had been promised. For 4 years, the Empire of Japan had waged a war of staggering brutality across the Pacific. From the beaches of Guadalcanal to the jungles of Burma, Japanese soldiers had been indoctrinated with a singular, unshakable belief. Surrender was dishonor, and death was preferable to captivity. The military code of Bushido, as interpreted by the imperial army, demanded absolute loyalty to the emperor and complete contempt for those who allowed themselves to be captured. Enemy prisoners in the Japanese worldview had forfeited their humanity. They were less than human, deserving only of exploitation, starvation, and death. This was the lens through which Japanese soldiers understood warfare. It was also the lens through which they understood their own potential fate. When the atomic bombs fell on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945, and Emperor Hirohito's voice crackled over the radio announcing Japan's surrender, millions of Japanese soldiers faced a reckoning they had never imagined. Scattered across the Pacific Islands, in prisoner-of-war camps from the Philippines to Australia to the continental United States, over 400,000 Japanese servicemen found themselves in American custody. They had been told stories, propaganda stories, but stories they believed, that the Americans were barbarians, that they would torture prisoners, mutilate bodies, commit unspeakable acts of revenge. That captivity under the Americans would be a living hell, a fate worse than the honorable death they had been trained to seek. But the reality they encountered was something their military training had never prepared them for. They were treated as human beings. The Japanese prisoners of war held in the United States during World War II experienced a profound cognitive dissonance. They arrived expecting violence, expecting degradation, expecting the same brutal treatment that Allied prisoners had endured in Japanese camps, the starvation rations, the forced labor unto death, the systematic cruelty. What they found instead was a system that, while far from perfect, adhered to the Geneva Conventions with a consistency that bewildered them. They were housed in barracks with beds and blankets. They were fed 3 meals a day, meals that, according to Army records, often exceeded 2,800 calories, more than many American civilians consumed during wartime rationing. They received medical care. They were allowed to write letters home, though those letters often went unanswered from a shattered homeland. And most shocking of all, they were offered work, voluntary work, for wages. The American government had established over 500 prisoner-of-war camps across the United States during the war, housing not only Japanese prisoners, but also Germans and Italians. Many of these camps were located in rural areas where labor shortages had become acute as American men left farms for factories and battlefields. The agricultural heartland was desperate for workers. Cotton needed picking in Texas. Sugar beets needed harvesting in Colorado. Orchards in California required tending. The solution, pragmatic and efficient in the American way, was to employ prisoners of war. Under the Geneva Conventions, prisoners could be required to work, but they had to be paid. Not much 80 cents a day, the equivalent of about $13 in today's currency. But it was real money, deposited into accounts they could access for small purchases at camp canteens or save for an uncertain future. For the Japanese prisoners, this arrangement was incomprehensible. Takeshi Yamamoto, a former infantryman captured on Okinawa, later recalled his first day of farm work in Idaho. He had been transported with 30 other prisoners in the back of a truck, bouncing along dirt roads that cut through endless potato fields. When they arrived at the farm, the owner, expression that Yamamoto could not read, not hatred, not even anger, just assessment, the way a man might evaluate livestock at market, the farmer showed them what needed to be done. Dig the potatoes, sort them by size, load them into crates. Simple work, backbreaking but straightforward. At noon, the farmer's wife brought out sandwiches and thermoses of coffee. The prisoners ate in silence, sitting in the dirt, unable to reconcile this small kindness with everything they had been taught about American savagery. At the end of the day, as the sun set over the mountains and turned the sky the color of persimmons, the farmer counted out their wages. He handed each man 80 cents in coins, the metal still warm from his pocket. Yamamoto stared at the coins in his palm as though they were artifacts from another world. He had been a soldier of the emperor. He had fought for the divine mission of the greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere. He had been prepared to die a glorious death. And now he stood in an Idaho potato field, covered in dirt, holding 80 cents he had earned by digging vegetables. The absurdity of it threatened to break something inside him, but what broke instead was his certainty. The treatment of Japanese prisoners of war in America was not motivated purely by humanitarian ideals. It was, in many ways, pragmatic. The United States military understood that well-treated prisoners were less likely to cause trouble, less likely to attempt escape, and more likely to provide useful intelligence. There was also a propaganda value. Photographs and reports of well-fed, well-treated Japanese prisoners could be used to encourage surrender among soldiers still fighting in the Pacific. And there was the matter of reciprocity, the hope, often futile, that treating enemy prisoners well might encourage similar treatment of American prisoners in Japanese hands. But regardless of the motivations, the effect on the prisoners themselves was profound. Many Japanese prisoners arrived in American camps malnourished, injured, and deeply traumatized. They had been fighting on remote islands with dwindling supplies, eating roots and insects, watching their comrades die of starvation and disease. When they were captured, often after being wounded and unable to continue fighting, they expected immediate execution. Some attempted to provoke their captors into killing them, seeing it as a way to preserve some shred of honor. Instead, they were given medical treatment. They were fed. They were housed. And slowly, grudgingly, they began to realize that their captors saw them not as vermin to be exterminated, but as defeated enemies who had temporarily forfeited their freedom. The farms became a particularly significant space in this transformation. Unlike the camps, where prisoners remained in a military structure under guard, the farms offered a glimpse of ordinary American life. The prisoners worked alongside civilian farmers, ate meals prepared in farmhouse kitchens, observed the casual prosperity of rural America, the tractors and trucks, the barns full of livestock, the waste that shocked them. One prisoner, interviewed decades later, remembered watching a farmer dump a bucket of spoiled milk onto the ground. Milk, fresh milk, poured out because it had soured. In Japan, milk had been a luxury even before the war. To see it wasted seemed to him a kind of sin, but also a revelation about the staggering abundance of this country. The symbolism of food recurred again and again in the testimonies of former prisoners. Food had been central to their wartime experience, the lack of it, the obsession with it, the way hunger had defined their final months of combat. On Saipan, soldiers had eaten grass. On Iwo Jima, they had fought on empty stomachs while American Marines consumed sea rations that seemed like feasts. The contrast between Japanese deprivation and American abundance was not abstract theory. It was lived, visceral reality. And in the prison camps, this contrast became impossible to ignore. The meals served in American POW camps followed Army guidelines designed to meet nutritional standards. Breakfast might include oatmeal, scrambled eggs, bread with butter, and coffee. Lunch, soup, sandwiches, fruit. Dinner, meat, potatoes, vegetables, dessert. To the Japanese prisoners, these meals were astonishing. They were eating better as prisoners than they had as soldiers. They were eating better than their families back in Japan, if their families had survived at all. Some prisoners gained weight in captivity, a fact that seemed almost obscene, given the malnutrition and starvation that had ravaged Japan's military. As the months passed, some prisoners began to volunteer for additional work details. The money was part of the motivation. 80 cents a day could buy cigarettes, toiletries, small comforts from the camp canteen. But for many, the work itself became meaningful. It gave structure to days that would otherwise blur into monotony. It provided a sense of purpose, however small, and it offered contact with Americans beyond the guards and camp administrators. The relationships that developed were complex and cautious. Language barriers made communication difficult. Cultural differences ran deep. Many American farmers had sons fighting in the Pacific, had friends who would never come home, harbored anger and grief that could not be easily set aside. Yet practical necessity often forced a grudging cooperation. A Japanese prisoner with mechanical skills might be asked to repair a tractor. A farmer might demonstrate a more efficient way to stack hay bales. Small gestures of respect could emerge. A farmer learning a few words of Japanese, a prisoner carving a wooden toy for a farmer's child. These were not friendships precisely, but they were human connections that transcended the categories of enemy and captor. Corporal Masa Watanabe, held at a camp in Colorado, later wrote about his experience working in the sugar beet fields. The work was grueling, bending over for hours under the harsh sun, thinning beets with a short-handled hoe, a task that left his back screaming in pain. But at the end of each week, he received his wages, and he was struck by the fact that the farmer paid him without resentment, without contempt. The farmer did not treat him as slave labor, but as a worker who had fulfilled a contract. This distinction mattered. It spoke to something Watanabe had not expected to find in America, a concept of fairness that transcended tribal loyalty, a belief that even an enemy could be owed honest payment for honest work. The ideological impact of this experience cannot be overstated. The Japanese military had indoctrinated its soldiers with a worldview that positioned Japan as the righteous defender of Asia against Western imperialism. The Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere, they were told, would liberate Asian peoples from white colonialism and establish a new order based on Japanese leadership. American democracy was portrayed as a sham, a hypocritical system that preached freedom while practicing racial oppression and economic exploitation. Japanese soldiers were taught that Americans were spiritually weak, corrupted by materialism and individualism, lacking the discipline and self-sacrifice that defined the Japanese warrior spirit. But the prisoners' lived experience contradicted almost every element of this narrative. Yes, they could see evidence of racial prejudice, the segregation in some areas, the discrimination faced by Japanese Americans, the complicated history of American racism. But they also saw a society that, despite its flaws, had codified rights for individuals, had systems of law that constrained even government power, had a prosperity so widespread that even farmers in remote rural areas lived with a material comfort that would have been unimaginable to Japanese peasants. They saw a country that could mobilize industrial production on a scale that dwarfed Japan's capabilities, that could feed its soldiers and prisoners alike, that could wage war across 2 oceans without starving its own population. And perhaps most significantly, they experienced a system that treated them, the enemy, with a baseline of human dignity. They had been taught that Americans were barbarians. They discovered instead a nation that, however imperfectly, tried to follow rules even in war, that valued human life even when that life belonged to an enemy, that believed in standards of conduct that transcended the immediate demands of victory. The turning point for many prisoners came in the months following Japan's surrender. As the reality of defeat sank in, as letters from home, when they came at all, described cities in ruins and families displaced, as the prisoners learned of the devastation wrought by the atomic bombs and the subsequent occupation, a psychological reckoning began. Everything they had fought for had ended in catastrophic failure. The emperor himself, once presented as a living god, had announced the surrender in a radio broadcast that used archaic, formal language to obscure the bitter truth. Japan had lost. The divine mission had failed. The sacrifice had been for nothing. In this context, the experience of captivity took on new meaning. The prisoners had survived. Against all expectations, against all their training, they had survived. And not through some miraculous military reversal, but through the mundane. And now, as they contemplated an eventual return to a devastated homeland, many found themselves wrestling with uncomfortable questions about the ideology they had served. Some prisoners began to study English in the camps, preparing for a post-war world where understanding America might be essential for Japan's rebuilding. Others sought out information about American democracy, asking guards and camp administrators about how the political system worked, how elections were conducted, how power was distributed and constrained. These were not questions motivated by admiration or conversion, but by a practical recognition that Japan had been defeated by a system fundamentally different from its own, and that understanding that system might be crucial for survival in the new order that would follow. The repatriation process began in late 1945 and continued through 1946. Japanese prisoners were transported to ports and loaded onto ships bound for a homeland many barely recognized. They returned to a Japan under occupation, its cities bombed into rubble, its economy shattered, its population traumatized and starving. The contrast with America, even the rural, agricultural America they had seen as prisoners, was stark and undeniable. Japan had mobilized its entire society for total war and had been utterly defeated. America had mobilized a fraction of its potential and had emerged victorious on two fronts simultaneously, its homeland untouched by bombing, its industrial capacity intact and expanding. For the returning prisoners, reintegration was difficult and painful. They carried the stigma of surrender in a culture that had venerated death over captivity. Many faced discrimination and suspicion. Some families refused to acknowledge their return, considering them already dead in spirit if not in fact. The men who had worked on American farms, who had been paid for their labor, who had eaten 3 meals a day and gained weight in captivity. These men were often resented and envied by those who had suffered through the war at home, scraping by on starvation rations, losing loved ones to bombings and disease. But many of these veterans also became quiet agents of transformation. They had seen another way of organizing society. They had experienced, however briefly, a system that valued individual rights, that established rules even in the conduct of war, that generated abundance rather than scarcity. As Japan began its post-war reconstruction under American occupation, as democratic reforms were imposed and gradually internalized, as the country transformed itself from a militaristic empire into a peaceful, prosperous democracy, some of those former prisoners played roles, usually small, often unacknowledged, in helping their society navigate that wrenching transition. Takeshi Yamamoto returned to his village in Kyushu in March 1946. His family's farm had been burned in an air raid. His father was dead. His younger brother had been killed at Leyte. His mother and sister had survived by eating sweet potato vines and dandelion greens. When Yamamoto showed them the few American dollars he had saved from his wages, his mother wept. It was the first real currency the family had seen in months. With that money, Yamamoto was able to buy seed for planting. He returned to farming, working the scarred land of his ancestors, trying to rebuild. But he carried with him the memory of those Idaho potato fields. He remembered the mechanization, the efficiency, the way American farmers fed a nation and exported food to the world. In the decades that followed, as Japan's agricultural sector modernized, as the country embraced American farming techniques and technologies, Yamamoto sometimes thought about that weathered farmer who had paid him 80 cents a day. He thought about the absurdity of war, the waste of it, the way millions of men had been mobilized to kill each other, when the real power of nations lay not in death but in production, not in sacrifice but in the ability to create abundance. He never spoke much about his time as a prisoner. In post-war Japan, such topics were awkward, tinged with shame and failure. But late in his life, interviewed by researchers documenting the POW experience, Yamamoto offered a reflection that captured something essential. We were taught that Americans had no spirit, no discipline, that they were weak and decadent. But I learned that a nation does not need to teach its soldiers to die. A strong nation teaches its people to live well, to build, to prosper. We thought our willingness to die made us superior, but we were defeated by a country whose strength came from its ability to create life, not glorify death. The story of Japanese prisoners of war working on American farms is a small chapter in the vast narrative of World War II, a footnote in the histories that focus on battles and strategy and the great movements of army, rigid militaristic systems in modern history. They had been taught from childhood to revere the emperor, to embrace death, to despise weakness and surrender. And then they found themselves in the custody of an enemy who fed them, paid them, and treated them according to rules that transcended the immediate demands of war. The experience did not transform all of them. Some clung to their old beliefs, refusing to acknowledge any virtue in their captors, maintaining a bitter resentment that would last the rest of their lives. But for many others, those months or years in American captivity planted seeds of doubt. Doubt about the superiority of the system they had served. Doubt about the narratives of American barbarism they had been taught. Doubt about whether the sacrifices demanded of them had been justified or even rational. These doubts, multiplied across hundreds of thousands of returning soldiers, contributed to Japan's post-war transformation. The nation that had embraced militarism and rejected Western democracy did not simply have democracy imposed upon it by occupation. It was also transformed from within by men who had seen the results of their nation's choices, who had witnessed the prosperity and power of the system they had fought against, and who, however reluctantly, acknowledged that something fundamental had to change. The recurring image, the symbol that threads through all these testimonies and memories, is the simple act of payment. The coins placed in calloused palms, the 80 cents for a day's work. It was such a small thing, barely more than token wages. But it represented something revolutionary to men who had been taught that their worth lay only in their willingness to die for the emperor, that individual labor had no independent value, that the only meaningful exchange was the sacrifice of life for collective glory. To be paid for work was to be recognized as an individual economic actor, someone whose labor had value in a market exchange. It was an implicit acknowledgement of personhood, of rights, of a social order based not on hierarchical obligation, but on contractual relationships between autonomous beings. This was the philosophical foundation of liberal democracy, embedded in the mundane transaction of wages for work. And for many Japanese prisoners, this was the first time they had encountered such a system not as abstract theory, but as lived reality. The coins they earned could buy cigarettes, candy, toiletries, small luxuries that reminded them they were still human beings with individual preferences and desires, not merely cogs in the military machine. Some prisoners saved their wages obsessively, seeing in those accumulated dollars a small measure of control over their own fate, a tiny buffer against the chaos and uncertainty of their situation. Others spent freely, embracing the present moment with the fatalism of men who had already expected to die. But all of them experienced, perhaps for the first time, what it meant to participate in a market economy based on individual choice and mutual exchange. The irony, of course, is that these prisoners were experiencing American capitalism at its most constrained and regulated. The wages they received were set by government policy. Their labor was involuntary in the sense that they were prisoners. The entire system operated under military oversight and international treaty obligations. This was not the free market of libertarian fantasy, but a managed, regulated system that balanced economic needs with humanitarian standards and diplomatic considerations. Yet even this constrained version of American economic life revealed a fundamental difference from the system that had mobilized Japan for total war. The Japanese economy during the war years had been a command system in which individual needs were ruthlessly subordinated to military production, in which the government controlled allocation of resources, in which workers and farmers were told what to produce and where to send it, with little regard for market mechanisms or individual welfare. The result had been a nation pushed to the breaking point, its people malnourished, its economy hollow, its productive capacity concentrated in weapons that were destroyed as soon as they reached the battlefield. The American system, even under the extraordinary strains of two-front war, had maintained enough market flexibility to generate prosperity alongside military production. American civilians had endured rationing, but they had not starved. American farms had continued to produce more food than the nation could consume. American factories had churned out weapons and consumer goods simultaneously. This combination of productive capacity and distributive efficiency, the ability not just to create wealth, but to spread it widely enough to maintain social cohesion, was the foundation of American power. And it was this that the Japanese prisoners witnessed in microcosm as the decades passed and World War II receded into history. The stories of these prisoners gradually emerged. For many years, former POWs remained silent about their experiences, reluctant to discuss the shame of capture or the complexity of their feelings toward their former captors. But as Japan transformed itself into a peaceful, democratic, and prosperous society, as the immediate trauma of war faded and historical research became possible, some veterans began to speak. Their testimonies revealed not a simple story of conversion or gratitude, but something more nuanced, a grudging recognition that they had been wrong about many things, that the propaganda they had believed had been lies, that the system they had served had led Japan to catastrophic defeat, while the system they had been taught to despise had demonstrated both material superiority and moral constraint. This was not the same as admiring America or abandoning Japanese identity. Many veterans remained critical of American policies, aware of the racism and imperialism in American history, skeptical of the occupation's heavy-handed reforms. But they also acknowledged a debt, if not to America as such, then to the principles of human dignity and lawful conduct that had spared them from the fate they expected. Some former prisoners became advocates for international humanitarian law, for the Geneva Conventions, for the idea that even in war there must be limits, rules that combatants must follow. Others became proponents of democracy and individual rights in post-war Japan, arguing that the militaristic system that had led Japan to ruin must be replaced with something that valued human life and individual dignity. These were not majority views in the immediate post-war period, when Japan was still reeling from defeat, and many conservative forces sought to preserve elements of the old order. But they were influential voices in the long process of democratization and transformation. The American farmers who employed these prisoners, also carried their own complex memories. For most, it had been a practical arrangement born of necessity. They needed workers, the prisoners needed work, the system made it possible. There had been nervousness at first, uncertainty about how to treat men who had been enemies, concerns about security and language barriers and cultural misunderstandings. But most farmers found the Japanese prisoners to be diligent workers, disciplined and uncomplaining, willing to do hard physical labor in all weather. Some farmers developed a kind of respect for these men. They saw how the prisoners carried themselves with a quiet dignity despite their circumstances. They noticed how the prisoners maintained order and hierarchy within their work groups, how older prisoners mentored younger ones, how they took pride in doing work well even though they were captives far from home. A few farmers, the ones inclined toward reflection, recognized that these Japanese soldiers were not so different from their own sons, young men caught up in a vast historical catastrophe, doing what they had been told was their duty, now trying to survive and make sense of a world that had shattered around them. After the war, most of these farmers never saw their Japanese workers again. The prisoners were shipped home and the camps were dismantled. The barracks stood empty for a while, then were torn down or repurposed. The fields where prisoners had worked returned to being worked by local labor, or, increasingly, by machines as agricultural mechanization accelerated in the post-war years. Life moved on. But some farmers kept small mementos, a carved wooden figure a prisoner had made, a handwritten note in halting English, a photograph of prisoners standing in a field, squinting into the sun. These objects, kept in attics and basements, passed down to children who had no direct memory of the war, became small anchors for a historical truth that was too easily simplified. The story of World War II in the Pacific is often told as a tale of good versus evil, of American righteousness defeating Japanese militarism. That story is not entirely wrong. There was genuine evil in the Imperial Japanese military's conduct, real atrocities that cannot be minimized or explained away. But the story is also more complicated than simple moral dichotomy allows. The Japanese prisoners who worked American farms were not monsters. They were men who had been shaped by a terrible system, who had done terrible things or at least been complicit in them, and who then encountered a different system that treated them with a humanity they had not shown to others. That encounter did not absolve them or erase the past, but it suggested the possibility of transformation, of learning, of emerging from ideological certainty into a more complex understanding of what humans contempt in his eyes. The realization that the enemy you had been taught to despise was neither demon nor saint, but simply human, operating within a system that generated different behaviors and outcomes than your own. These small revelations, repeated across thousands of individual experiences, contributed to one of history's remarkable transformations: the conversion of Japan from a militaristic empire into a peaceful democracy. That transformation was not solely the work of American occupation policy, though the occupation played a crucial role. It was also the work of Japanese people themselves, wrestling with the catastrophic failure of the system they had served, searching for new ways to organize their society, drawing on their own cultural resources, but also learning from the example of the nation that had defeated them. The prisoners who worked American farms were among the first Japanese to encounter that example not as theory or propaganda, but as lived reality. They were the advanced scouts of a transformation that would reshape their entire nation. They did not choose that role. They would have preferred never to have been defeated, never to have been captured, never to have found themselves standing in a frozen field in Idaho or Colorado or Texas, taking coins from an enemy farmer's hand. But history had placed them in that position, and what they learned there, reluctantly, painfully, against their will, became part of the knowledge that Japan would need to rebuild itself from ashes. The enduring image, the one that captures the essence of this strange chapter in history, is of a young Japanese soldier standing in an American field at day's end, dirt under his fingernails, sweat cooling on his back, staring at coins in his palm. He had expected violence. He had received payment. He had expected degradation. He had encountered, if not kindness, then at least justice according to law. He had expected confirmation of everything he had been taught about American barbarism. Instead, he had found evidence that his teachers had lied, that the world was more complicated than he had been told, that abundance was possible and need not be built on the glorification of death. In that moment of recognition, something shifted. Not everything, not immediately. The soldier would carry anger and grief and confusion for the rest of his life. He would struggle to reconcile what he had believed with what he had experienced. But the seed of doubt, once planted, would grow. And from that doubt, eventually, might come the possibility of something new. Not the unthinking certainty that leads nations to war, but the humility that allows them to learn from defeat, to change, to build societies where individual life has value and dignity matters even for enemies. This is the quiet power of treating prisoners well, of adhering to law even in war, of demonstrating through action rather than words what a different kind of society can be. It will not prevent all wars. It will not convert all enemies, but it plants seeds that sometimes, years later, bear unexpected fruit. The Japanese prisoners who worked American farms returned home with memories that complicated the simple narratives of national glory and righteous cause. They brought back with them a troubling question. What if the enemy had been right, not about everything, but about enough to matter? What if our suffering had been for nothing? What if there was a better way? These questions, asked by men who had paid in blood and suffering for the answers, helped remake Japan. They helped turn a nation of warriors into a nation of builders, a people who glorified death into a people who celebrated life. The transformation was neither complete nor perfect. Japan struggled with its militaristic past, with denial and revision, with the difficulty of acknowledging guilt while preserving dignity. But the transformation was real nonetheless, and the prisoners who had worked American farms, who had been paid 80 cents a day for digging potatoes or harvesting beets, were part of that transformation's foundation. They had gone to war expecting to die for the emperor. Instead, they lived and learned, and carried home a truth more powerful than propaganda, that abundance defeats scarcity, that life defeats death, and that a society built on recognizing human dignity, even the dignity of enemies, holds power that no amount of fanatical sacrifice can overcome. This was the lesson written in coins and meals and quiet labor, in the frozen fields of America's heartland where former enemies became, if not friends, then at least fellow humans trying to survive a world at war. And that lesson, humble and small as it seemed, helped change the course of a nation's history.